From the moment I met Eliza, I knew she was different. It was the summer of 1996, and she walked into a coffee shop where I was passing the time with a book I no longer remember. But I remember her. Her infectious laugh, her energy, her ability to make any moment feel magical. I, Martin Richardson, was drawn to her from the start. Our first conversation wasn't smooth. She spilled her coffee. I knocked over my chair trying to help, and we laughed in a way that made strangers feel like old friends. By the winter of 1998, we were married, exchanging vows in a snow-covered church, believing, as young lovers do, that forever was guaranteed. The early years were full of adventure. Eliza poured herself into her art, while I climbed the corporate ladder. We built a home, filled it with laughter, with love, and eventually, with 2 children, Nicholas, born in 2003, and Sarah in 2005. Life was busy, but good. We were happy, or so I thought. The cracks began to show. As the years passed, something changed. Nicholas was in middle school when I noticed the first cracks in our marriage. Small at first, easy to dismiss. A missed anniversary here, a distant glance there. I was consumed with work, and Eliza, always passionate, became more withdrawn into her art. She spent hours locked in her studio, and our conversations grew shorter. I told myself this was normal, that marriage ebbed and flowed, but deep down, I felt something slipping away. In 2017, the distance became undeniable. She spent more nights away from me emotionally, even when we sat in the same room. I began staying late at work, dreading the silence that waited for me at home. One evening, sorting through the mail, I noticed a letter addressed to her in unfamiliar handwriting. It was postmarked from a town 2 hours away, a place we had no ties to. I hesitated, tempted to open it, but placed it back on the counter, telling myself I was overthinking. But I wasn't. The beginning of the end. By our 20th anniversary, I made one last attempt to bring us back together. I planned a surprise dinner, hoping to remind her of the love we had built. But when I got home, excited to celebrate, I found only an empty house and a hastily scribbled note on the counter. "Don't wait up." That night, I sat at the table, staring at the note, the flowers in my hands wilting. That night, I slept on the couch. Over the next few months, we became strangers living under the same roof. I noticed more changes. Her phone always turned face down, whispered phone calls when she thought I wasn't around, sudden weekend trips to clear her head. I wanted to confront her, but part of me was terrified of what I'd hear. Then, in the summer of 2019, I came home early and saw her car in the driveway. Something felt off. I walked inside, calling her name, but there was no response. The door to her studio was slightly open, an unusual sight. Inside, I found her sitting on the floor, surrounded by empty wine bottles and discarded sketches. Her eyes were red, her face streaked with tears. "Eliza," I said softly, "what's going on?" She looked at me with something close to regret. Something close, but not quite. "Martin," she whispered, "I've made a terrible mistake." Those words marked the beginning of the end. The confession. In the days that followed, the truth unraveled. Eliza had been having an affair with a man she met at an art exhibition, a collector named Michael Gray, a man who had admired more than just her work. I sat in silence as she confessed, my world crumbling around me. "I never meant for it to happen," she said, tears running down her face. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake her and ask how she could do this to us. To me, to the kids. But all I could do was stare at her, my hands trembling. "When?" I asked, my voice hollow. She hesitated. "Almost a year." A year. I had been living in a lie for a year. The separation. The weight of her betrayal crushed me. Our home, once filled with memories, now felt like a prison. For the sake of the kids, we tried to pretend for a while, but it was useless. The dinners where we once laughed now ended in suffocating silence. Nicholas barely spoke to either of us. Sarah clung to me, sensing the inevitable. By the end of the year, we separated. She moved into a small apartment near her studio. I stayed in the house with Nicholas and Sarah. The silence that once felt unbearable now felt like a relief. But the pain remained, a quiet ache in my chest. Sitting alone in that empty house, I couldn't help but wonder, how had we ended up here? How had something once so strong fallen apart so easily? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for certain. Life as I knew it would never be the same. The days after Eliza's confession felt like a slow-motion car crash. The shock reverberated in everything. Our conversations, our silences, even the way we moved around the house, careful not to cross paths. At night, I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying her words over and over. I've made a terrible mistake. A mistake. That's what she called it. But it wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal, a chasm that had swallowed us whole. The first time I tried to talk to her about it, I found her in the kitchen, standing at the sink with her back to me. The smell of her perfume, faint but familiar, caught me off guard, and for a moment, I forgot why I was angry. "Eliza," I started, my voice cracking despite my effort to sound steady. She turned, her eyes hollow and rimmed with red. "What, Martin?" I had so many things I wanted to say, but none of them came out right. Instead, I just stood there, my fists clenched at my sides. "Why?" Her gaze dropped to the floor, and the silence that followed was deafening. When she finally spoke, her words came out like a whisper. "I don't know." "You don't know?" My voice rose, sharp with disbelief. "You threw away 20 years of marriage, and you don't know why?" She flinched as if I had struck her, and for a moment, I hated myself for making her look so small. But then anger took over again, a tidal wave of frustration and hurt that I couldn't hold back. "Eliza, you owe me more than that," I said, my voice trembling. "You owe us more than that." Her head snapped up, and for the first time in weeks, I saw fire in her eyes. "Don't you dare act like you're blameless in all this, Martin. I've been drowning for years, and you didn't even notice. Do you know how lonely I've been? Do you?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond but realized I didn't know what to say. Had she been lonely? Had I really been so blind? That night, I sat in Nicholas's room after he had gone to bed, staring at the shelves lined with his books and soccer trophies. The room smelled faintly of sweat and teenage boy cologne, a sharp contrast to the sterile emptiness of my own bedroom. I thought about the man I had become, the man who had been too busy, too distracted to see what was happening right under his nose. By the time I finally climbed into bed, Eliza was already asleep. I lay on my side, listening to the sound of her breathing, and wondered how we had ended up so far apart. The days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere in the house grew heavier with every passing moment. Nicholas avoided me, retreating into his world of school and sports. Sarah clung to me, her small hands gripping mine as if she were afraid I might disappear. "Daddy, are you mad at Mommy?" she asked one night as I tucked her into bed. The question caught me off guard. I knelt beside her, smoothing the blanket over her shoulders. "No, sweetheart," I lied. "I'm not mad at Mommy. Sometimes grown-ups just have a hard time understanding each other." She nodded, her eyes wide and serious. "Will you fix it?" I wanted to tell her yes, that everything would be okay. But the truth lodged itself in my throat, too heavy to speak. "I'll try," I whispered instead, kissing her forehead. But trying wasn't enough. One evening, I came home to find Eliza packing a suitcase. She didn't look up as I walked into the bedroom, didn't say a word as she folded her clothes with mechanical precision. "What are you doing?" I asked, though the answer was painfully clear. "I'm leaving," she said simply, her voice devoid of emotion. "For how long?" Her hands paused, gripping the edge of a sweater. "I don't know." I stood there, watching her, waiting for her to look at me. But she didn't. She just kept packing, her movements slow and deliberate. "Eliza, please," I said, the words catching in my throat. "We can fix this. We can go to counseling, or—" "No, Martin." Her voice was firm, final. "We can't. It's too late." I didn't try to stop her. I didn't know how. When she left, the house felt emptier than I could have imagined. Nicholas and Sarah sat at the dinner table that night, eating in silence, their eyes darting toward the empty chair where their mother used to sit. "Where's Mom?" Nicholas finally asked, his voice tight. She's staying somewhere else for a while, I said, trying to sound calm. Is it because of you? The accusation in his tone cut deep, but I didn't blame him. How could I? I had failed him, failed all of us. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat in the darkened living room. Max, our old Labrador, lay at my feet, his head resting on my slippers. The quiet was suffocating, the kind of silence that made every creak of the house sound like a scream. I thought about Eliza, about the life we had built together, about the pieces of it that now lay shattered around me. I thought about Nicholas and Sarah, about how I had to be strong for them even when I felt like I was falling apart. Most of all, I thought about the man I used to be, the man who had stood in front of a church 20 years ago and promised to love and cherish Eliza for the rest of his life. I didn't recognize that man anymore. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, I had made a decision. I couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the mistakes we had both made. But I could try to move forward, to give my children a life that wasn't defined by anger and regret. It wouldn't be easy. But then again, nothing worth having ever is. The weeks after Eliza left felt unreal. I was living in the same house, following the same routine, but everything had lost its weight. The air felt thinner, the walls emptier. I threw myself into work, staying late, answering emails that didn't matter. Anything to avoid walking into a quiet house that no longer felt like home. Evenings were the worst. The dinner table felt too big. Sarah sat quietly, playing with her food. Nicholas barely came down at all. One night, as I passed by the living room, Sarah was curled up on the carpet, sketchbook in hand. "Are you okay, Dad?" she asked softly, not looking up. I paused, caught off guard. "I'm trying," I said, sitting beside her. She nodded, shading a sunflower. "I think trying is good enough." Her words stayed with me long after she went to bed. A month after Eliza left, she called. Her voice sent an uncomfortable chill through me. "Can we meet?" she asked hesitantly. I should have said no, but something in her tone, something fragile, made me agree. We met at a cafe we used to love, a place once filled with laughter and whispered dreams. Now, it felt like a graveyard of memories. Eliza was already there, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in weeks. "I wanted to apologize," she said, voice trembling. "Not just for what I did, but for everything. For how far apart we let things get." I clenched my jaw. "Why now, Eliza?" She exhaled shakily. "Because I need you to know, it wasn't about you." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Her fingers tightened around her cup. "It wasn't because you weren't enough. It was because I wasn't enough for myself. I felt invisible, Martin, like I didn't matter anymore." The words hit like a punch. I had spent months blaming her, hating her, but I had never considered that maybe she had been drowning too. It didn't make it right, but it made it make sense. "Eliza," I whispered, "you could have told me." She let out a broken laugh. "I know. I should have. I hate myself for what I did. If I could take it back." "You can't." She flinched. "The thing about betrayal," I said, voice tight, "is that it doesn't just go away. It lingers." She wiped at her face, fighting back tears. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to hear me." The silence stretched too long, too painful. I pushed back my chair. "Goodbye, Eliza." And then I walked away. That night, I found Nicholas in the backyard, kicking a soccer ball against the fence. Over and over. Hard. Angry. "You okay, bud?" I asked. He didn't stop. "Why do you care?" His words stung, but I kept my voice even. "Because you're my son, and I love you." The ball finally rolled to a stop. He turned, eyes filled with something deeper than anger, betrayal. "Then why didn't you fight for her?" My breath caught. "What?" "You let her leave," he said, voice shaking. "You didn't even try to fix it." I sat on the patio steps, motioning for him to join me. "Nick, sometimes trying to fix something only makes it worse." He clenched his jaw. "That's just an excuse." I sighed. "Your mom and I, we hurt each other in ways we can't undo. And it wouldn't be fair to pretend we could fix something that was already broken." His shoulders slumped. I just wish things were different. I reached for him, and for the first time in weeks, he let me. His head rested against my shoulder, his body tense, like he wasn't sure if he wanted comfort or distance. "So do I whispered. And for the first time, I realized wishing wouldn't change anything, but maybe moving forward could. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, I found an old notebook buried in the garage. I ran my fingers over the worn leather cover, the pages inside yellowed with age. Writing had always been my escape, my way of making sense of things. I hesitated, then picked up a pen. At first, the words came slowly, awkward, stiff, but then they poured out of me. I wrote about Eliza, about Nicholas and Sarah, about love and heartbreak, and the things we lose when we stop paying attention. I didn't write to find answers. I wrote to let go of the questions. By sunrise, my hands ached, my eyes burned, but for the first time in months, the weight on my chest felt just a little bit lighter. And for the first time, I thought, maybe this wasn't the end of my story. Maybe it was just the beginning of another. The months after my conversation with Eliza felt like moving through water. Slow, heavy, exhausting. Every day was about keeping things steady for Nicholas and Sarah, but inside, I was unraveling. Nicholas drifted further away, coming home late, locking himself in his room. When he did speak, his words carried resentment, sharp enough to cut. Sarah, on the other hand, never left my side. She watched me with quiet worry, her big eyes asking the questions she was too afraid to say out loud. "Are we still a family? Are you still you?" Then, one afternoon, Eliza called. Her voice was tight with panic. "It's Sarah. She won't come out of the bathroom at school. The principal called me. She's locked herself in." I don't know what to do. My stomach clenched. I'm on my way. The drive felt endless. My hands gripped the wheel so tight they ached. When I arrived, the principal met me, concern etched deep in her face. "She won't talk to anyone," she said. "Maybe she'll talk to you." I found Sarah curled up on the cold tile floor, her head buried in her arms. "Sarah," I whispered, kneeling beside her. "It's me." She didn't move, but when she finally lifted her face, her eyes were wet, red-rimmed, lost. "I don't want everything to change," she choked out. I pulled her into my arms, holding her as tightly as I could. "I know, sweetheart. I know." It took time, but eventually, she let me help her up. That night, I tucked her in and sat beside her until she drifted to sleep. And for the first time in months, I let myself cry. The next day, I called Eliza. "We need to talk," I said. "For the kids." She hesitated, then agreed. We met at a park near her apartment. The air was crisp, the leaves turning amber. We sat on an old wooden bench under an oak tree, the weight of everything between us. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted, her voice small. "I don't know how to make up for what I've done." I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. "Neither do I." She looked down. "Do you still hate me?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to hold on to the anger, because letting go of it felt too much like forgiving. But when I looked at her, I didn't see the woman who had betrayed me. I saw the woman who had once been my best friend, the mother of my children, the person I had loved for 20 years. "I don't know," I admitted, "but the kids need both of us. So we have to try." Tears welled in her eyes. "Thank you, Martin." It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was a start. 2 weeks later, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. "Mr. Richardson?" a woman's voice asked. "This is Dr. Holloway from County General. I'm calling about Eliza." The air left my lungs. "What happened?" "She was brought in this morning," the doctor said gently. "She overdosed on prescription medication. She's stable now, but we thought you should know." The drive to the hospital was a blur. My hands shook as I walked into her room. Eliza lay there, pale against the white sheets. When her eyes fluttered open, she looked at me with something close to shame. "Martin," she whispered. I sat beside her, struggling to breathe. "Why?" My voice cracked. "Why would you do this?" Tears slid down her cheeks. "I didn't want to feel anymore. I didn't want to keep hurting you. Or the kids." Her words hit me like a fist. I had been so consumed by my own pain, so focused on what she had done, that I hadn't seen how much she was suffering too. Eliza, I murmured, taking her hand. You don't have to do this alone. Her fingers tightened around mine. For the first time in months, I saw something in her eyes. Hope. The road to recovery was slow, messy, painful. Eliza entered treatment. I juggled work, parenting, therapy sessions. Nicholas was angry, resistant. But little by little, the walls between us began to crumble. Sarah became my anchor, her quiet strength holding us all together. One night, as we sat watching a movie, she turned to me and smiled. I think we're going to be okay, Dad. And for the first time in a long time, I believed her. Life didn't magically improve after Eliza started her recovery. It wasn't a movie where everything falls into place. Healing was slow. It was waking up in the middle of the night, feeling the weight of everything unsaid. It was making dinner in silence, the clatter of plates louder than the words we didn't say. It was Nicholas shutting his door too hard, and Sarah watching me like she was afraid I'd disappear too. But healing also had moments, small, quiet victories I almost missed. It started with Sarah. One evening, as we stood in the kitchen making spaghetti, she paused and looked up at me. I think you're doing okay, Dad. I frowned. You do? She nodded. You're here. You're trying. That's what matters. Her words stayed with me. I didn't feel like I was doing okay. Most days, I felt like I was just holding everything together with worn-out thread. But maybe, in her eyes, effort was enough. Nicholas, though, was different. He carried his anger like armor, refusing to let anyone in. He ignored Eliza's messages, left the room when she visited Sarah. I wanted to fix it, to make him see that anger wouldn't save him, but I knew he had to get there on his own. One evening, as I was unloading groceries, Nicholas leaned against the counter, grabbed an apple and said, I saw Mom today. I turned to look at him. Yeah? How was it? He hesitated. She looked tired, but she said she's trying. I nodded. She is. She's doing her best. He didn't say anything else, just stood there for a moment before heading back to his room. It wasn't much, but it was something. A few nights later, Eliza called me. It was late, her voice unsure. Do you think they'll ever forgive me? I sighed. I don't know. She was quiet. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, I don't want them to hate me forever. They don't hate you, I said gently. They're hurt. That's not the same thing. She let out a shaky breath. Thank you. That was the thing about Eliza now. She didn't pretend anymore. She wasn't making excuses. She was just a woman trying to make sense of the damage she had done. As weeks turned to months, Sarah and Eliza grew close again. They had lunch dates, painting afternoons. Sarah would come home covered in flecks of color, talking about the new techniques her mom had shown her. Nicholas, though, stayed distant. If Eliza texted, he'd send a one-word reply. If she visited, he'd disappear upstairs. I wanted to tell him it was okay to be mad, but I knew I couldn't force him to let go. One night, I found him in the backyard, kicking a soccer ball against the fence. Do you ever think about before? He asked. Yeah, I admitted. I think about it a lot. He stared at the ball. I don't know if I can forgive her. I nodded. That's okay. He frowned. It is? Yeah, I said. Forgiveness isn't something you owe anyone. It's something you do for yourself, when you're ready. He kept kicking the ball, his movements a little less rigid. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like he was listening. Meanwhile, I wrote. Late at night, when the house was silent and my thoughts were too loud, I sat at the kitchen table and poured everything onto the page. It wasn't just a story. It was a way to make sense of everything I couldn't say out loud. One night, Sarah caught me at it. Is it about us? She asked. Kind of, I said. It's about a family, about forgiveness, about trying to find your way back to the people you love. She nodded. I think people need stories like that. Maybe she was right. When Eliza reached her one-year sobriety milestone, she invited us to a small gathering at her apartment. Nicholas resisted at first, but Sarah convinced him to come. The dinner was stiff, but by the end of the night, something softened. Eliza shared stories about her recovery, about the moments that nearly broke her. She even laughed at herself, telling us how she once burned water trying to make pasta. Nicholas didn't laugh, but he listened. As we put on our coats, Eliza pulled me aside. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me try." I studied her. The woman I had once loved, the woman who had hurt me, the woman who was standing in front of me now, still flawed but still here. I nodded. "We're all trying." That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat at my laptop and started a new chapter. This time, it wasn't about endings. It was about beginnings. Because for the first time in years, I believed we might actually have one. The celebration at Eliza's apartment was a turning point. It wasn't perfect, and the cracks in our family were still visible, but for the first time in years, it felt like we were all moving in the same direction. Even Nicholas, who had been so closed off, seemed to soften, if only slightly. Still, progress wasn't linear. There were setbacks, nights when Nicholas would slam his door after a tense dinner, or when Eliza would call me in tears, overwhelmed by the weight of rebuilding. But the difference now was that we were all trying, even in our imperfect ways. It was a chilly Saturday morning when Nicholas approached me in the garage. I was working on some old shelves that needed repairing, trying to distract myself from the million other things weighing on my mind. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching me, before finally speaking. "Dad," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Can we talk?" I set down the hammer and wiped my hands on a rack. "Of course. What's on your mind?" He hesitated, staring at the floor. "I've been thinking about Mom. About everything." I nodded, giving him the space to continue. "I'm still angry," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I don't know if I'll ever stop being angry. But I miss her. I miss how things used to be." His words hung in the air, raw and honest. I felt a lump form in my throat. "It's okay to feel both, Nick," I said gently. "It's okay to be angry and still miss her. Those feelings don't have to cancel each other out." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think she knows that? That I miss her?" "She knows," I said firmly. "But it wouldn't hurt to tell her yourself." Nicholas didn't respond, but later that day, I noticed him texting her. It wasn't much, just a small step, but it was something. A few weeks later, I finished the first draft of my manuscript. It was far from polished, but the act of completing it felt monumental. Writing had become my lifeline, a way to process everything that had happened and make sense of the chaos. One evening, Sarah found me at the dining table, staring at the pages I'd printed out. "Is it done?" she asked, her eyes lighting up. "Almost," I said with a small smile. "It still needs a lot of work. Can I read it?" I hesitated. The story was deeply personal, a reflection of everything I had been through. But Sarah had been there through it all. She deserved to see it. "Okay," I said, handing her the stack of pages. "But be gentle. It's not perfect." She took the pages with the reverence of someone holding a sacred text. "I promise," she said, grinning. That same week, Eliza invited me to one of her art shows. It was her first exhibit in years, and she was nervous. I almost didn't go. Part of me was afraid of seeing her in her element, afraid it might stir up feelings I wasn't ready to confront. But Sarah convinced me. "She's trying, Dad," she said. "The least you can do is show up." The gallery was small but packed with people. Eliza stood near one of her larger pieces, a vibrant, abstract painting that seemed to pulse with emotion. She looked up when I entered, her eyes widening in surprise. "You came," she said, her voice soft. "I came," I replied. Her work was stunning, raw and evocative in a way that felt deeply personal. As I moved through the gallery, I found myself drawn to a smaller piece tucked away in the corner. It was a series of overlapping colors and textures, chaotic but somehow harmonious. "That one's about us," Eliza said, appearing at my side. I turned to her, surprised. "It's messy," she continued, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But there's beauty in the mess. At least, I hope there is." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in years, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with. She wasn't perfect, neither of us were, but she was trying, and that was enough. The turning point for Nicholas came a few months later. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, and we were all gathered at Eliza's apartment for dinner. Nicholas had been quiet all evening, his usual wall of indifference firmly in place. But as we sat around the table, laughing at one of Sarah's stories, he suddenly spoke. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant. Eliza froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Yes?" He looked at her, his expression conflicted. "I'm still mad at you. But I'm trying not to be." Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. It wasn't a declaration of forgiveness, but it was a start. By the time the kids went back to school in the fall, life had settled into a tentative new normal. Eliza and I were co-parenting more effectively, communicating in ways we hadn't in years. Nicholas was spending more time with her, and Sarah was thriving in her art classes. As for me, I had sent my manuscript to a small publisher on a whim, never expecting to hear back. But one crisp October morning, an email landed in my inbox. They wanted to publish it. I stared at the screen, disbelief flooding through me. When Sarah walked into the room, she took one look at my face and grinned. "What happened?" "They're publishing my book," I said, the words feeling surreal. She squealed, throwing her arms around me. I knew it. I knew it was good. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of pride, not just in the book, but in myself. I had taken something broken and turned it into something meaningful. The first copies of the book arrived a few months later, and I held one in my hands with a mix of awe and disbelief. The title, Falling and Rising, felt fitting. It was a story about heartbreak, but also about resilience, about finding light in the darkest moments. Eliza came to the book launch, standing in the back of the room with Nicholas and Sarah by her side. Afterward, she hugged me tightly, whispering, "I'm proud of you." "I'm proud of us," I replied, and I meant it. Because even though the road had been messy and painful, we had all come out the other side. We weren't the same people we had been before, but maybe that was okay. Maybe the beauty really was in the mess.